Weekly Show with David J. Maloney. This week, David talks to author Jessica Moor. And now, here's your host, David J. Maloney.
Welcome to everyone at home, and I would normally say our studio audience to the weekly show. I am your host, David J. Maloney. I say normally because we usually shoot the show before a small studio audience at the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino, but we are still shooting from home due to coronavirus concerns. And because we are still shooting from home, sitting in for our regular house band, the Mogiles, again with me tonight is my son, Gianni. So Fox has canceled its TV series Filthy Rich. Network executives made the decision after realizing the show was still on. And Khloe Kardashian is the new spokesperson for Nurtec ODT, a drug for migraines, which is ironic because Khloe is the leading cause of migraines. And in her new memoir, Tina Turner opens up about her decision to relinquish her U.S. citizenship. She says she still loves America, but what's love got to do with it? Oh, and scientists are now saying gene manipulation will allow people to one day live to be 500 years old. Upon hearing this, Congress advised it will soon be voting to increase the retirement age to 450. And did you hear this? Mental health care providers are warning that using the internet too much can cause psychological problems. The good news is, though, that help is available online. And according to a new study, the most unhealthy fast food item is Wendy's Pretzel Bacon Pub Triple Cheeseburger, which contains 1,910 milligrams of sodium, 45 grams of fat, and 1,520 calories. If you order this, be sure to leave room for dessert. That way you'll have something to eat in the ambulance. No? Let's try that one again. According to a new study, the most unhealthy fast food item is Wendy's Pretzel Bacon Pub Triple Cheeseburger, which contains 1,910 milligrams of sodium, 45 grams of fat, and 1,520 calories. It tastes so good, it's recommended by 4 out of 5 cardiac surgeons. No? Maybe third time's a charm. According to a new study, the most unhealthy fast food item is Wendy's Pretzel Bacon Pub Triple Cheeseburger, which contains 1,910 milligrams of sodium, 45 grams of fat, and 1,520 calories. I don't want to say it's bad for your heart, but it's endorsed by Dick Cheney. I know the joke hits when my son loses it from behind the camera. On tonight's show, we welcome a rising star in the literary world. Jessica Moor is the author of the new book, Keeper, which is already being hailed as a must-read novel for anyone interested in the thriller genre. It's even being compared to the fantastic Gone Girl. She's a passionate intellectual, a wonderful author, and you don't want to miss our chat. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. G? Our featured guest tonight is a fantastic new author. She's here to talk about her debut thriller novel, Keeper, which is already making waves in the literary world. Please welcome to the show, Jessica Moor. Jessica, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So your debut novel is out, and it's on its way to a wonderful paperback release. What does it feel like to be at this point?
Well, it's interesting because I've got nothing to compare it to, but obviously releasing a novel in lockdown is very different to releasing a novel in normal times. You don't do any events in person, and I was actually in quarantine the day that my book first came out, so I couldn't go and see it in shops. But having worked on the story for, well, it was 4 years now that I started the book, 4 years ago that I started the book. So to finally have that out there in the world and have people responding to it and getting in touch to tell me their thoughts and sometimes quite personal, emotional stories has been wonderful, if a little bit surreal.
I know for a lot of writers, it's a real lifelong fight to get where you are now. Does it feel kind of like a culmination of a dream finally coming true?
Yes. I mean, I think I first announced that I wanted to be a writer when I was 4 years old. So as long as I've been sort of aware of myself as a person, I've always wanted to be a writer. But then it's interesting because you think that once there's a physical book that you can hold in your hand, then you will feel somehow different, and you remain the same sort of unfortunate person. But yes, it's interesting because you now have to think, well, what am I going to do next now that the thing that I thought I would spend my whole life trying to do has been achieved? So I need to, I guess, write another one.
Before we get into the book, let's talk about you a little bit. What was life like growing up for you?
I'm from London. I had a very sort of normal, slightly bookwormish childhood. Always sort of watching people, trying to get a sense of who they were, which I think was just my sort of shyness and trying to figure out how to incorporate myself into other kids playing, but I think then served me well as a writer. So yes, I went to school. I went to an all-girls school, which is an interesting experience and I think informs the book in some ways. And then I went off and studied at university and then worked in the violence against women and girls sector, which had a focus on domestic violence. And that was really the thing that I wasn't working in the sector thinking I'd better write a book about this. I think that if you go about any job that way, then you don't sort of throw yourself into it. But it was a question of looking at the system and understanding how things really worked, as maybe I might have assumed they worked or might want them to work. And that made me feel very angry. And as I sort of stepped away from that and decided to focus more on the writing, there was only one thing that I really could have written about.
So is that how writing came into your story?
Well, I've always written. As a child, I wrote a lot about sort of cats getting stuck up in trees. But I think I'm naturally a debater. I'm somebody who gets very impassioned by issues. And I think that the way that I make sense of those issues and try and see them from all sides and try and understand how they're a product of humanity is to explore them through novels, because I think what fiction can do is put us in someone else's shoes. We have to empathize. And so that's the wonderful thing about a novel, is that you have to empathize with everyone, and not just the people that might seem easy to empathize with. You've got to put yourself in everyone's shoes. So for me, that was the way that I kind of filtered my experiences and came to understand them, and was able to kind of settle the anger inside me into something that was a bit more possible to live with and possible to turn into action.
At what point did you decide that you could do writing full time? Was that like in university?
I don't know if I ever decided that, because I think that one of the adages that I grew up with was that if you want to be a writer, you'll end up living in a cardboard box. So I didn't think that was ever going to be possible, but at the same time, it was the only thing I ever wanted to do. So I thought maybe I could do writing in a sort of more indirect way. I could maybe be a copywriter, or when I was in the domestic violence sector, I was actually putting together grant proposals. I was trying to get money. So I was writing, but it wasn't the same as the kind of writing that I wanted to do. And then when I'd written Keeper, I was lucky enough that I was able to go full time with that. And quite honestly, I can't imagine myself doing anything else.
What was the first book that truly moved you?
That's a very good question. The first book that I ever read by myself was a book called Fantastic Mr. Fox by Roald Dahl. I don't know if he's very popular in the States, but he's a very famous children's author in the UK. And it's about a fox who's being hunted by a pair of three evil farmers. And it was the first book that I ever read by myself, and I think I was 5. And I took it home, and I can remember sitting on the sofa. I can remember the light in the room. I remember everything about it. And I remember just being fully transported for the first time in my life. And just being sucked into this book and then emerging for air 3 hours later, whatever it was. And I think that sense of being moved by this story and the characters really taught me what books can do. And I think that a lot of the books that I love the most are the books that I read as a child, And I often think that what I'm trying to do as an adult is recapture that page-turning thing, that totally immersive thing that is maybe easier when you're a child, and we sometimes lose as we grow up.
It's interesting. It's easier, but yet these days for a lot of children, it's not, because so many people they're into their phones. You know, they're into their electronics, their iPads, and so it's I worry that now a lot of children who I grew up reading. I used to love to read Eric Ambler books, and Eric Ambler books were kind of like the James Bond spy movies.
Yeah.
They were well, not movies, but books, obviously. And I used to immerse myself in those. It's tougher these days, I think, to get today's youth to delve into the books, like you said. And I wonder how that's going to translate later. You know what I mean? And to be frank, reading it on a computer is not the same as the palpability of having the page in your hand. It's just not.
There's always that possibility that you can get distracted with a computer. I mean, it's very hard to write a book if you have access to a computer, let alone settle down to read one. And I think that one of the things that I'm very glad was possible when I was a child is that I was bored a lot of the time. And when you're bored, you find something to do. But if there's no possibility of ever being bored, how are you going to find that? I suppose the solution is, I don't know, lock kids in rooms without computers. But I'm not a parent, so I don't know whether that's a viable suggestion.
So, Jessica, we are going to go to a quick break, and then we want to come back and talk a little bit more about your book, some of your influences, ghostwriting, all that fun stuff. Can you stick around?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, we'll be right back with Jessica Moor. And we are back with author Jessica Moor. Jessica, I know you've talked about Zora Neale Hurston as being a major influence, and I'm actually right now interviewing you from Mobile, Alabama, and she actually wrote a fantastic book called Baccaroon, chronicling Africatown community of our city right here. Just a little bit of interesting trivia here.
That's wonderful. I love that connection.
And just last week we had Ben Raines on the show, and he discovered the Clotilda, which was the last slave ship, which was from Africatown. So small world in that sense.
Absolutely.
So now, doing some research on you, I read that you were once a ghostwriter of romance novels. What was that experience like, and who is Norma Dauntless?
So after I finished in the States you'd call it an MFA, I was sort of shopping my book around and working on it. And I had to do something in the meantime, but I didn't want to sort of throw myself into some other whole career. I thought, well, I'll see if I can make a living by my pen. And I found that actually you can find sort of ghostwriting gigs online. And I thought, I'm going to need a persona in order to really get into the character of this ghostwriter who writes outrageous plot lines. So I sort of invented a persona for myself who sports a pink kimono and one of those sort of big headbands, and sort of swans around her apartment with a glass of champagne in her hand, saying, "Darling, I've got to write this now." So that was me. And that only lasted a few months, which is probably a good thing because I was writing like 5,000 words a day, which is not sustainable. But I think it was very good for me, actually, because it was a good bit of sort of craft training in making yourself write something that is compulsively readable, because the kind of books that I was ghostwriting, that was you had to keep reading them. That was the whole point. So it was a fun anecdote and also a good bit of training.
So let's talk about your debut novel, Keeper. It's finally hitting the bookshelves in the new year. Tell us about the book.
So the book is about a young woman called Katie Straw who works in a women's shelter. And she's a young woman with a lot going for her. She's smart, she's educated, but something happens and she dies, and we don't know why. And the circumstances around her death are explored partly through the perspective of the women in the women's shelter who she was working with. So it's a novel that takes place through multiple perspectives, and it's about these women each having a little piece of the puzzle of Katie's story and how that ultimately comes together.
How did the idea for the novel start? I know that you've worked firsthand in the violence against women sector. Was it in part based on that? Was it from somewhere else?
It was, well, that was what was going around my head. And I wanted to write something based in a women's shelter because I thought it was really interesting to think about a bunch of people who were in the same situation or had ended up in the same situation thrown together, who might be from drastically different backgrounds and circumstances and their own different perspectives on how they'd ended up there. So that was my starting point. And then I thought there needs to be something to sort of pull us through, and often that is somebody dying. A body turns up, we have a story. So that was where that came from. And then there was a sort of piece which was exploring the police's point of view. And that arose from my concerns over the sort of failings that I had seen throughout the system. And I wanted to explore, I suppose, the humanity of that and how that could come to be. And it's not necessarily people being malicious. It's not cruelty. It's systems can sometimes fail and they can let people down. So those sort of three main strands came together and formed the novel.
At what point did you realize that you had a good story?
I think I felt that I had a story that was worth telling because I think it was almost a sense that I had a piece of, I had something that I needed to share in terms of what I'd learned about domestic violence. And I felt, I didn't know whether it was a good story, but I knew I wanted to share that. I wanted to convey that message. And so I thought, well, I better make it a good story.
Were you ever surprised by the story or the characters as you wrote it and as it came together?
I was sort of surprised by some of my experiences writing it. Mostly, there's one particular character who is the police officer. And I was surprised by how much I sympathized with him. He makes some choices that I don't think are great, but I really went as far as I could into that character and tried to understand his humanity. And that was quite surprising to me that I ended up feeling quite fond of him, which I sort of forced myself to do. But in terms of the plot and in particular the ending was in place from day one. I knew that there was a sort of critical point, a climax that I had to work towards. And so that was always on the horizon.
So we talked a little bit about it before. You've worked firsthand in the violence against women sector. What are the things that we as a Western society keep getting wrong in that sense?
I think one thing that I saw people getting wrong again and again and again was that the reason that, domestic violence can happen to anyone and be perpetrated by anyone, but the overwhelming majority of victims, particularly victims of very serious violence and murder, are women. And there's often a story which is that the reason that these women might stay in this relationship is because they're sort of weak or they're masochistic or they, aren't fully understanding of their own situation. And a lot of the time there is very concrete reasons why people would stay. And the biggest reason why a woman might stay is sort of illuminated by the statistic that the most dangerous time for a woman is the moment that she leaves. So a huge number of the homicides that go on to happen after the woman has left. So if she's just thinking about her safety, then there's a very good case for staying. And I think that's not well understood, and it needs to be at the center of people's understanding of domestic violence. And what else would I say? I think it's just about, I think a big problem is the idea that there's a single image of what a victim looks like. A victim can be anyone. It's not a particular age, race, class. we do broadly know that most victims are female, but obviously there are male victims. There can be domestic violence in LGBT relationships. There's no one single script of what that violence might look like.
Do you see any solutions to those problems? And if you do, how do we get people on board with that?
Well, I think a huge solution is money. We do sort of know what works, and it tends to be giving someone somewhere safe to go. But that isn't necessarily the cheapest option. I think in the long term, there's much to be said for educational solutions and teaching people what a safe and loving relationship looks like, because unfortunately, a lot of people do inherit the idea that, that someone could hurt you and they still love you, or that love hurts. And I think until we sort of reprogram that script, this is going to keep happening over and over. So there's an immediate piece, which is funding and expertise. And then there's the long-term solution, which I think, as with most things, can only be education.
So let's get back to the book for a second. Where can our audience order their copy of it? And well, let's go with that first. And then I want to ask you about what we can expect from you in the future.
Sure. Well, wherever they normally buy books, I don't know. There would normally be a much easier answer to that, but obviously some things aren't open. So if your bookstore's open, then go there or order it from them online. It's obviously available at Amazon and all good bookstores.
What should we be able to expect from you in the future? You said you're working on another project now, huh?
Yes. I describe myself to my editor as a sort of feminist hermit crab. So I like to go inside genres and sort of unpick their perspective on maybe women and their position in the world, and figure out sort of what the cliches of a genre are and how I might reinvent them with a specific perspective. So I'm working at the moment on a sort of contemporary novel, which, not to give too much away, is considering the aftermath of the Harvey Weinstein situation and the state of Me Too and the choices that women make.
Well, Jessica, thank you so much for joining us. I know sometimes in these times it's difficult for people to be able to connect, and we normally shoot the show with a small audience, and we shoot it at actually the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino, but because of these times we are doing it this way. But in some ways it gives us the opportunity to interview guests that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to get on the show. So we're so happy to have you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
That is our show for tonight. Thank you so much for watching. Special thanks to Jessica Moore for joining us. I want to wish everybody happy holidays. Taking us home tonight, still sitting in for the Mojiles, my son Gianni.